All right. So I thought today I had a number of sort of thoughts, and here's something I'd like to start with. I dropped some notes, I think, into the chat. I might do it again. Um, as I do the readings, I sometimes take notes about stuff that I think is really kind of interesting. Uh, and thinking in particular of jumping ahead to the Ojibwe language reading, which is called Task-Based Language Learning for Ojibwe, a case study of two intermediate adult language learners. And basically, like when I read these articles, sometimes I'm thinking specifics like how does this help me as a teacher and how does this help me to sort of develop a language program? And then sometimes I'm just reading it out of an interest of someone who studies language revitalization. But the task-based language is something I've been thinking a lot about. My conversations with Deho, Jeremy Green, who's Mohawk, they really like some of the task-based stuff. And basically, as I was thinking of it, like the Ojibwe language reading really got me thinking of it. And we're going to try some stuff in advanced Tlingit tonight that's task-based learning. But basically trying to sort of, and we got to really separate task-based learning with like teaching people how to do things. Like I think if you're going to teach the language, it is very difficult to teach how to do things at the same time. Like, it might be wonderful to say, well, fish skin sewing is highly endangered, and we used to know how to make these bags out of swan feet, and they might have really cool things that you want to teach people how to do, or we're going to learn how to bead in the language. But if they don't already know the language, it becomes very hard to teach them through the language, this whole other thing. But you could do it for sure as long as you were staggering some of this stuff. Like I say, we're gonna teach you how to bead in the language. Then I think you got to have a number of sessions that's just going over all the vocabulary you've got, the nouns, the phrases, the other things, and then teaching people what to say when they're frustrated because they did the wrong thing. And then you can sort of go in, and that could be the task. But the task based is sort of like saying, okay, like taking this Ojibwe example, everybody watches video on how to make fry bread, and everybody watches a video. And then we all get together on an internet video call, and everybody sets up their camera so that you can't see each other's hands and the bowl and the working space. And we talk to each other and talk through the process. So we've already learned how to do the thing, but now we'll do the thing together and use the language as a medium of communication to do the thing. So some other examples. I don't want to give away what we're going to do tonight, but you could come up with sort of conversation challenges. But when they say task-based, it's sort of like there's some goal that's involved, there's some activity that's involved to get you out of the I say it, you say it, I say it, you say it, I say it. You can get stuck in some of these patterns sometimes of language learning, and people start getting full, and they also don't have the day-to-day application, right? So let me show you something real quick, and then we're going to do a little exercise. So while I was doing work in Hawaii, uh, I came up with this graphic to sort of help myself. Like a lot of the things I was learning over there, I draw pictures because it helps me to understand stuff. And so what we're really talking about with language revitalization and language reclamation and language revival, and also stabilization. So like just in terms of like how we use those terms, if you've already got enough speakers that you feel like your language is going to survive, then you're in this mode called language stabilization, which is really just saying keep it healthy. If your language has too few speakers and you're trying to increase that number, that's language revitalization. It doesn't mean you acknowledge that your language is dead. It just means we just got to get that number up. If you don't have any speakers right now, then you're looking at language revival, which is, I don't like the term dead or extinct, but it is bringing your language back from no speakers to adding speakers. And so I think some of these things help because you can move from revival to revitalization to stabilization. Ideally, we're all moving towards stabilization. And then we're collectively working at, well, how do we maintain this for 10,000 more years, right? So for me, I started to sort of think about, well, how does this stuff work? And reclamation means you're reclaiming the language and you're reclaiming indigenous spaces. So just kind of starting at the top is fluency. So for me, fluency is how familiar is the language with an individual? How likely are they to understand what they hear and to be able to say what they want to say? That's all I think that's all that fluency is. And people can argue about, finer points or whatever. But just in terms of like trying to figure out what you're trying to do is just continue to raise the fluency of everybody in the language. And for some, it's maintaining that fluency. Because if you have, like Tlingit maybe has two or three, four speakers who could do really high level stuff. And I always think like, who do they have to talk to? Who's going to talk to them? We have to talk to them so that, they feel engaged and that they can share their knowledge. Then there's normalization, which is how familiar is the language with the landscape. As you walk around the community, do you see it? Do you hear it? And so these are things that sometimes you need to actively do through place name restoration, building signage, public radio. You know, the public radio station in Juneau, KTOO, has been learning Tlingit for over a year. So that like their whole staff is learning Tlingit, and it's just it's great. It's great to see that kind of initiative. The vernacular is a little trickier, but it's really just sort of saying, do people use the language to talk about the stuff that they like to talk about on a day-to-day basis? So it's not just saying, hi, how are you? How's the weather? Now let me tell you what's going on. And, do people like to play bingo? Okay, have them do it in the language. Do they like to play basketball? Have them do it in the language. Do they like to watch TV? Have them talk about it in the language. Do they like to gossip about stuff? Have them do it in the language. Do they like to flirt? Have them do it in the language. Do they like to, well, they might not like to, but maybe some people do. Break up, have them do it in the language. We're doing breakup phrases today. It was kind of fun. Um, Not that breaking up is fun, but and then just sort of saying like, what do people talk about, and how do we give them the tools to select? We got to make it the language of choice. And then reclamation is sort of, oh, how likely is it to be a medium, and then taking into a social sphere, physical or social spaces where the language is used. Are people hunting in the language? Are people beading in the language? Are they harvesting medicines in the language? Are they ordering coffee in the language? Like, so think of all these things and how you could claim those spaces for the language. And I think all of this is done with courage and determination, ancestral guidance, love for self and people, kindness and humility. So this is sort of my abstract roadmap to language revitalization. That these are the main things that I tend to focus on, and then those things on the outer sphere is sort of what I rely on to guide my work. So thinking of that, well, I guess first, anybody have any thoughts or questions on any of those things?
I was particularly interested in the emotional exchange between two people around your concept of vernacular, because in study groups, when people come on, I'll ask them, "Wasayeti?" And I can feel, even through Zoom, I can feel this vibe of they're like, okay, I'm gonna do it, and it's like we go through that together. And I don't know, our emotional state is such a huge part of our willingness to speak. And it's kind of cool to see people's growth in that area. But yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, there's this thing that I was sort of studying about, like, how do you increase the likelihood that people will choose the language to talk in? And so a lot of this, like there's some fancy studies on this stuff, and I think we could build on this. We can indigenize some of these processes. But I think it's been touched on a lot, like having a safe space, feeling like it's okay to make a mistake. I mean, when you have endangered languages, there's so much on the line that you end up with people saying, if you can't say it right, then don't say it, right? Which I'm like, oh, that's a language killing phrase. It really is. And then you end up with people making fun of each other, and then you have like just weird, hurtful behavior. And then you also have stuff like you're ruining the language, you're changing the language. And some of these phrases, which I think don't come from a place of really helping, right? Like, but they're also, you know, people can't just do whatever they want. However, if nobody's speaking, you have to self-analyze and figure out some things. And on a cultural side, you might have to change some things. And these are conversations I think language communities need to engage in. But when I was sort of looking at this stuff, so if you zoom in, what they're saying is there's like foundational stuff, which is the big picture, but then the higher you go, that has a higher influence on whether or not people will choose the language. So as I was going through, starting at the bottom, you have social and individual sort of things like what is the climate like of the group? Does it foster use? Does it encourage people to try? Does it shut people down? You know, like one time I don't know, I was just messing around a little too much. I made somebody cry by the way I corrected them. And I felt so bad, but we talked it out. We sort of figured out some things that I was doing, that they were doing, that we were both feeling. And then personalities. You might have people who are extremely shy, and you might have people who don't like big crowds. And so you're going to have to figure out like how do we create the environments for that work for the larger group and that work for the majority of people. It might have to be a whole multitude of things. Intergroup attitudes, like this is really important. Like if we know, if it starts to feel like, you know, like a popularity contest or this group and then this group, you know, I was on this one board of uh, political leaders and I just hang out with everybody because, you know, we're all from different communities. And one day someone said, hey, why do you go to lunch with them? I was like, I don't know. They just asked me to go to lunch and I was just visiting. And they said, well, we don't like them. And I said, well, I'm not in high school. You know, I was like, I could be friends with whoever I want. And that includes you. And so, but is there some of that stuff going on? Like, oh, that's that group and we're this group. Um, the social situation, right? So these things can matter as well. We all have we have our the language has culture, and then the culture is associated with various hierarchies and belonging and place and all kinds of stuff that could come up with that. And so if you only have 40 speakers, what do you do if two people break up? You know, it's like, okay, you guys gotta keep talking to each other. So, you know, and you're gonna have to have some of those conversations. Communicative competence. Can they say the things that they want to say? Which we read in coming back to the Ojibwe thing. It's like, how do you possibly do it? The languages are so complicated. They're so complicated. How do you get people to learn this stuff? Those are big questions so that they feel comfortable. And you know, and even if they say, well, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but I think that's how you say it. But if you can get them to that point and then get them to keep going, interpersonal motivation, like do they really want to do this? And so and these are challenges, really incredible challenges, because as a language teacher, you don't want to just assume people are lazy or, you know, if they really wanted to do it, they would do it. You know, but some of those things I think creep through from the Euro-American form of education, which, you know, we could talk about too. And then intergroup motivation. Does the group do the thing? And so if we always have to switch to English because, you know, we're with this group of people, then we'll just stay in English, right? And then is there confidence in the language? And from our perspective, we're going to read some things like when they say L1, L2, L1 is the language that people were born speaking and grew up speaking, and then L2 is a second language that they learn. And a lot of the adults that we have are going to be second language learners. But I also want to talk about that because we have some folks, there's a term for folks who were born and grew up around the language. And some of them can absolutely understand everything. Absolutely. You know, we're sitting at the dinner table. I'm trying to get my daughter to eat asparagus. And I said, Guk kana'ak, ziyako kasayeyi, gachdusnik eshuku. So I said, try it. Later, your pee's going to smell funny. Because I thought that would be a motivating factor. And I got balled out a little bit. And I forgot that my auntie can understand. You know, but she was teasing me when she said, that's not dinner time conversation. And so, but they used to call folks like this dormant speakers. And then they called them, oh, there was another term. Everybody remember the other term? Silent speakers. Maybe those are the first. Those are the only two I could think of right now. But the current term is probably fluent understanders, which I'm not sure if that's the greatest term, and I don't know if we really need terms. However, there are people who can understand the language. But I'll tell you something else. I was in a room one time with someone who was on their. Sometimes our elders, when they're on their deathbed, they want to only speak in their indigenous language, their first language. Like really when their mind is on its way, they revert. And I've seen situations where they won't even speak English. So someone came and got me. They said, "Can you come talk to my grandma? She's only speaking Tlingit and we don't know what she's saying." And I've been in those situations and it's intense. And then, but I was in a situation like that and talking to an elder who was going to be gone. And one of the relatives was translating everything we were saying, and I could hear them, and it was very accurate. But I thought, well, how do we cross that bridge then? Because sometimes for all of us, I think something that's missing from here is there's these spiritual and emotional barriers. But maybe it's on here towards the bottom. Let me open up the chat to make sure I don't miss anything. Oh, latent speaker, that was it. Sheesh. So latent, dormant, silent. Now we got fluent understander, but it's someone who they can understand it. And I think they would need a different mode of teaching than most adults who are coming in from not knowing the language at all. So we get up and we get a desire to communicate with a specific person. Do you want to talk? You know, I've heard people say like they don't want to talk to me in Tlingit because they're scared. And I want to move beyond that and just say, you know, if you talk to me in Tlingit, it's gonna be like so many jokes and funny stories and just fun stuff. So go for it. Um, Communicative self-confidence, like do you feel good and capable and can you do it? Are you willing to communicate in the language? And then do you use the language? And so like this kind of stuff was interesting to me as well. Sort of like how this stuff um, comes together because I would say there's been, I don't know, if you think of how long the Tlingit language has been taught, there's got to be thousands of students who have taken a class at some level. But how many have become speakers? And these are things that I think about as well. Any other thoughts, questions? And I could share the article with you folks too, that this comes from. Okay. So, a task-based language activity, right? Like for example, and you can really have fun with this stuff. Like the things that I'm thinking of, and I'd say, okay, we're going to break everybody into two groups. And we're going to pretend, we're just going to craft a dialogue between two people. So group one has to go and make like a question or a statement. Uh, for example, I could say, okay, group one, break off and you say something that you're super happy about. Like your grandkid just won the basketball tournament, you just won a bingo, whatever that thing is. Make something up. You are a person who's extremely happy about something. You're anxious to share the news with your longtime friend. So they break off and they go do that. And then maybe, so you have team one and team two, and they collaborate to craft a single statement to start a conversation. It's a totally fictional exercise, but it's pushing stuff towards day-to-day communication. So then when they come back, and I'd probably have group two do the same thing so we could cycle it through twice. So then when we come back, I'd tell group two, I'd say, okay, group one, give them your statement. So they would give the statement. Then I'd say, okay, group two, react to your friend giving you this information. And so that means they got to go have something to say about it, maybe ask a question, maybe dive a little bit deeper into the content. Um, and so it's basically sort of doing some stuff like that and just sort of having some fun. Another task-based thing that we did, since we have clans and things, we had a class where we divided into, we just divided into ravens and eagles because we have these two big clan groups. And it's okay, here's a scenario. We're at a totem pole raising hosted by the Tehuidi. That's one of our clans. And they have raised the totem pole. They have done an amazing job feeding us and entertaining us. And we are standing up towards the end of the event as ravens to say thank you. So you all are going to compose your thank you statements. And then we all broke off and they composed thank you statements and they read them all. And then the eagles all went off and then they did their work session where they composed their responses. And it was so fun. It was so fun that because we've been doing these little puppets in class, and so they, I gave them time ahead of, because sometimes some of the stuff is spontaneous. As a language teacher, sometimes things will just come up, like, oh, I think this, I just had a good idea. Let's do this. Uh, Other times, you might not want them to, you might want to spring it on them, right? Because it's like, okay, dive into the books and do this kind of thing, just to sort of, I think there's an advantage to sort of playing around with how much people have expectations so that they can be prepared. So you say, okay, go home over the weekend and write your speeches. Come back and we'll do them on Monday. But then there's other times too where you want them to, it's not like you get to plan out every single language event. So I think sometimes there's a real benefit to it. But then sometimes, and then also, I think just whenever you have a class or a workshop or whatever, sometimes people just get into this, here I am, here's what I do, here I am, and you got to sort of shake that up a little bit. So, who would like to share? What do you think? Let's brainstorm some task-based language activities. Hit me up. What do you got?
We did one before, the pros and cons of Edsamanai on fry bread. And I was in the con group, which was really hard to come up with reasons why fry bread wasn't good.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but we had a debate on that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so you could do, I like this, the pros and cons, right? So, because yeah, I've had to do this in history class when I was in my undergraduate program, and they sort of set aside these models of government, and ours was like ruling with the iron fist. And I didn't want it, but I got to come up with like lots of cool. It was really fun because people got so mad at me because they're like, "What about artists?" I was like, "No, you gotta go live somewhere else. You gotta be producing for the state, or else you can't live here." And like they get so mad at me, and of course I never believed in any of this stuff, but I had fun. So you can have fun with this stuff too. So yeah, you can assign them these kind of things like, should pineapple be on pizza, or I don't pick big things, right? Like don't pick like huge hot button topics like abortion or the drinking age or anything like that. But do stuff that's a little bit silly, but then some things that people might really feel for. And then have them, because I think another thing that happens in our languages is we don't learn how to argue. Because people sometimes, and an argument could be a really heavy thing. And maybe we need to practice some of this stuff as well. But it could be just a debate, right? Like, is this thing good or no? And then, and it could be really, it's, keep it fun. But then sometimes I think we gotta learn how to do some of the other stuff too. Other thoughts, ideas?
Maybe dating and relationships.
Yeah. So like you could do something like an always encourage consent and good behavior. But yeah, you could say, okay, you're two people who are meeting in a language environment, and then how do you start the conversation? And and most of the stuff that we're doing is artificial, and it's artificial because we're trying to build it towards the real. So you could say, okay, John, you know, there's again team A and team B, and you're each just represent a single individual, and you just draw a number or something to see who gets to go first, and say, okay, you gotta break the ice for this first date conversation. What are you gonna say? And then you could sort of do some stuff like that, and you could work in some flirting and others, and everybody's just having fun. But I think this stuff is beneficial too. So if you know, I mean, eventually you want people to who speak the language to be getting together, and then if they're getting together with non-speakers, and you want to bring those people into the fold as well. Great. Building on that, or other ideas. So
Dining
there's.
room
Oh, go ahead.
conversation.
Sorry, what was that, Duck Juice?
Dining room conversation.
Yeah, dining room conversation, right? So like, and some of this stuff, like you could just take a week or so, and while I remember one time I had a creative writing class, and we went to a coffee shop, and we were assigned to be creepers, like just go sit by people and listen to what they're talking about, and write down their conversations, right? And so I'm not really encouraging you to go do that necessarily, but with your family or with your group, whoever you're eating with on a regular basis, just take some notes. What do we talk about? How do we do this thing? Because what's really weird for me is sometimes when you say, okay, let's do this, let's just be ourselves in the language, and then nobody even knows how to be themselves. It's like, ah, whoa, but it's just because there's this pressure of performing, and this is the key for me for normalization. Is make it's just like, oh yeah, oh, we'll do that thing. Oh yeah, yeah, we can switch language, no problem. And so, but I also know it's exhausting. It's mentally exhausting. I was with some friends, and we went to this. They had this all-day language gathering here in Juneau. And so we were there for like 8 hours, and it was intense. And it was, some of us were facilitating a lot of things there. And then we just go for a walk to like hang out and decompress after the whole thing's over. And we were walking, and it was so quiet. And one of us said, I don't even remember how to talk anymore, because we're just like so, just trying to be in that mode where I'm trying to understand everything and learn and know how to say the thing. And it was so funny because like we even like kind of forgot how to communicate with each other. And so we were just sort of like downtown looking for like some dinner or something. And one of us, we're all really close friends. We all use the language. And then we switched over to English. One of them said, I used to sleep behind that building. And so I said, were you like unhoused, or did you not have a place or something? And they said, oh, no, no, I used to work. Part of my job was to drive this person around for the day, and he'd go do something. I'd just go over there and take a nap. I was like, oh, you could have started at the beginning. It's like, it's just a weird place to say, like, I used to sleep behind this building. But we were just laughing because we were so punchy. Like, when you do this stuff, like this full immersion stuff, and if you haven't done this before, it's incredible how intense it can be. So some of these task-based things are to sort of relieve that pressure. And I think some of it could be just being a little bit of a spy on your own behavior, because sometimes you don't have to think about it, but just like literally writing down, like, how did we start a conversation? What did we talk about next? How did we talk about that? And you don't have to like be like the anthropologist in the room, right? Where like you're just sitting there really recording what everybody's doing. But I think reflecting on that so that you can then say, okay, here's the things I need to teach people how to say, and here's the things I need to learn how to say. And then because you're really trying to say, if we really want this thing to work, going to be replacing the language we use. But, and I had this really interesting, well, I think it's interesting, this question I was asking people a few years ago, which was this: when you speak a different language, are you a different person? What do you think of that? That's a question.
Is that a discussion question for now?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I think I definitely think differently when I use a different language, not just in terms of word order, but the way I relate to people and connect to people. I think it has a lot to do with my life's experiences. Like in English, I've just developed a habit of being very forward and direct and maybe a little bit standoffish. Like I've heard people tell me you're too critical and stuff like that, which, it's something I'm working on. But in Tlingit, when I'm speaking Tlingit, I'm learning as a guest on Tlingit land. So I tend to come from a place of wanting to speak with respect, speaking and thinking through Tlingit Tundatani, or way of thinking as I perceive it, and trying to uplift cultural values. So I guess my relationship with the language is different than my relationship with English.
Yeah, and a language is attached to a culture. And I think sometimes the culture, like here's an interesting thing, I think. So like Tlingit has a culture, right? And it has many cultures. Because with just if you're ethnically Tlingit, that doesn't mean you think a particular way. Uh, but there is sometimes a difference between people who do speak the language and people who do not. There's things encoded in the language. Like nobody ever told me like sneezing out of the left nostril is not deadly, and just a whole number of things that I think are pretty specific to the language. And one example would be we're learning Hawaiian, and our teacher said, I don't know how it got brought up, but he said, "Oh, when you see someone's baby, you're not supposed to say how cute it is. You're supposed to say it's ugly." I was like, "You set me up? You gonna get me punched in the face? I feel like this is set up." He's like, "No, no, no, it's what you do." And so, as luck would have it, so like sometimes these things really fall into place. Like they're just, it was our destiny to call it a baby ugly. Um, so we went, and then someone was showing us at the language school. We went to visit the language school, and they're all gathered around a computer. And we're like, "What's going on? What are you guys looking at?" And they said, "Oh, look, it's so and so's new baby, and she's right there." And so I was like, "Go ahead then, go tell her, tell her." And he's like, "Oh," and then they all started teasing, and it got so loud, and they were just, it was obviously true, but it was something like I didn't understand. Like it blew up in such a big way. But this was the culture, like the absolute culture, and there's some stuff as well, like and we were talking about this in Advanced Tlingit the other day, like how do you tell someone off, and what do you do when you're mad, and like seriously, because if we don't know how to do this stuff, it's going to become a war because we don't know how, because even just small disagreements, we can have these. And these could also be the task-based things. Like, okay, group A, here's what you got to say. This is your good friend, and you got to tell them, hey, you've owed me $50 for like 2 months. Could you pay that? And then, this could be a real scenario, right? And so then, okay, person B, you gotta you gotta come back. You gotta be kind of, and you can even prescribe some emotions to this as well, just so that what you're trying to do with task-based learning, I think, is prepare folks for interacting in the world through the language. If everything is classroom language, then you don't know how to do real life language. I think classroom language is needed because it gives you this structure, but you've got to get it out of that classroom and into the day to day. You got to say it either sing it or hide or I'm not paying. That's awesome. Okay. So also thinking about another thing I want to talk about today is how do you plan to execute these things? Like, so thinking of the big picture of language teaching, and this could vary if you're dealing with little kids, you're dealing with um, adolescent kids, or you're dealing with adults. But what's your balance for all of these things? Repetition, right? Because they gotta see it, they gotta hear it, say it, hear it, say it. But then sometimes you gotta break that rhythm too, because to be honest, like for most language programs, like if you just map out, like so people sleep, like let's say if people sleep 8 hours a day, then there's I'm not gonna be able to do this math, but that's 40 hours per week. Is that right? No, it's anyway. If you just map out how many hours are in a week, right? And then you might have 4 contact hours with your students per week. Maybe, but maybe you're going all day, right? So maybe you're going 4 hours a day. So maybe you have 20. But either way, you're never going to be with them the majority of the time. So that means you have to be strategic about how you spend your time with your students. So you're going to do repetition. Students at some point are going to have to start reciting things. If it's a brand new intro class, I would wait a long time before you ask them to say something, to perform something. Right? I would probably say wait 2 weeks before you start asking them to sort of say, okay, no, you say it. Just, then how do you deal with feedback? What kind of feedback do you give them? Do you just, when do you correct them? When do you not? Sometimes you just let it all go. But then these are some things too, as you start to hear things as a teacher. Usually my strategy is I just listen for stuff and then I create lessons out of that. And then that's how we go. Because every group is going to have similar but very different group dynamics. Um, are you going to do a conversational response? Like, so if they say something, can you engage them in conversation? When do you praise them? How often? And then what do you do about behavior modifications? What if you do have someone who's kind of being inappropriate in one of your classes, or if they're sort of being hurtful, and then you're the teacher and you got to interact. So with any of these things, so repetition, reciting stuff, giving feedback in a variety of ways. Any thoughts on this stuff? The tumbleweed day? Is everyone just singing the Alaska flag song out there? What's going on? Just talking to the void.
I'm trying to shut up so other people can talk.
Okay. Well, I'll share my strategy. I have a series of strategies with all of this stuff, and I think about it all the time. And like, there's gonna be so much stuff to do. Um, so coming back as well, like sometimes in sort of linguistics.
Had enough of it.
Oh, wag.
I'm sorry.
No, tell me off then. Fine.
Oh no, we were just laughing and talking about how we like the part about dating. So we're still on that and laughing and joking. And then the part about negotiating and about being diplomatic in wars and discussions. And then the part that you heard was I sort of don't want to talk about war. I've been involved in that enough already. I just prefer to stick to the dating. So sorry, my finger just slipped on the button. We're in sunshine, so I think I need a little bit of sun here. I'm sorry, goodness geez, thank you for taking a moment to listen. So we think it's going to be funny, an older lady and a younger lady talking about dating.
No,
Okay, sorry.
pandemic ends, I'm gonna make a remix album that's called like the unfortunate unmute timing, because you never know. There's all kinds of stuff in the background, like I'm sure I told you folks, but a couple of golden moments that I've heard about was someone was they called in This is before like Zoom, and so everything was like teleconference. And for this, it was a kind of like a department meeting for an academic unit, right? And so there was only two people who called in. Everybody else was in the room. And then all of a sudden, like on the phone, you can hear someone going pee because they forgot to mute the phone. And it wasn't the other person on the phone. And he was telling me about it. He says, I just wanted to yell, "That's not me!" But then he couldn't, because then he'd sort of be outing the other person, right? And then a friend of mine teaches classes called Rural Development. And so they call them RD classes. And so one of her students had called in and forgot to mute herself. And somebody knocked on the door. And then they could hear it, open the door. And like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know you're in class." And she says, "It's okay, it's just RD." So, nothing like that has happened yet here, so it's all good. It's all good.
Was that me that everyone heard peeing? Because that was like one of my biggest fears.
No, this was a professor, and they were all professors, and so from one professor to another. But I wasn't on that call. I only heard about it. It sounded legendary. Uh, okay. But I think one of the things that is important, though, is the content. Like, what do people want to talk about? And then how do we get them that vocabulary? And then how do we sort of, like, part of our goal, I think a big part of our goal, is replacing the entire language structure. And that's a huge thing. It's a huge thing. And so sometimes what we're doing is just little teeny pieces. But then can you always see that big picture, so that if you are, the key, I think, to making speakers is create these environments that are safe to use the language and where that language use is encouraged. Then when you start seeing people that can speak to them in the language. Which brings me to another question. And I know my questions aren't getting answered here today, but that's okay. What do you prefer when you talk about the language that you're working in? Do you say the language, the target language, the language of choice, heritage language, indigenous language?
I have a brief answer. I like to just call it in our language what it is, Hudkill. I
Yeah,
just refer to it as that.
right. Which is, we're in this kind of dialogue. There's probably going to be a call for papers from the Alaska Native Studies Council, because we want to sort of say, we're going to make another language map through the Alaska Native Language Center. And what should it look like? Like, should it still say Koyukon, or should it say, and so most language, and should it say Haida, or should it just say Hatkil, and should it say Tlingit? And so there's going to be a new version that comes out that's going to be continuing to indigenize it, to be indigenized. And so, like, these are the things that that I think are really interesting. And so sometimes if you're talking to people, and so there's this kind of the internal and the external. And the internal is the group that's doing the thing. The external is people who aren't. And sometimes you got to be pretty strategic about this stuff. And so sometimes you want people to switch over, say, okay, I want everybody to start saying Tlingit. It'll be better if everybody just says Tlingit and we adjust everything else. And the whole world can adjust to us because we've been adjusting to the whole world. But then sometimes you're having these discussions as well, like with these larger sort of planning groups. But then as we sort of come along, did I talk to you folks about Ho Chunk in here? So the other day, this was probably a month ago, like I got a dictionary app on my phone. And it gives me the word of the day. And I think it's mad at me now because it just always gives me the same word, like zigwung or something like that. But about a month ago, it said the word of the day is Winnebago. What is Winnebago? Anybody know what Winnebago is? And the definition was like a tribe, a group of Native Americans from the plains. So I tried to write to the Oxford Dictionary people. It's not like they're easy to find. I was like, man, you guys got to update this because that's not their name. They're called Ho-Chunk. That's what they're called. So when I went to college in Minneapolis, they had just made this shift from Winnebago to Ho-Chunk. And I talked to this elder. I said, hey, why you guys Ho-Chunk? I thought it was Winnebago. And I don't know anything, so I just want to know. He says, well, Winnebago is what the people next to us would call us. So a lot of times in colonization, as you go from east to west, the colonizers would be saying, well, who are those guys? Who are those guys? Who are those guys? And then sometimes that name becomes the name for those people, like kind of officially. And he said, and it's not always a great thing. He says, sometimes we just want to be able to say who we are. That's the biggest thing. But then he said, sometimes the names that we have for each other aren't that great. So this is what he told me. Sorry for I guess I won't name the tribe that he was talking about. I'll try and protect myself. He says, so a long time ago, there's this tribe that neighbors us. And when we first figured out they were over there, we sent some scouts to go look at them. And there were some people who were bathing themselves. So they were watching them. And they came back and they gave us a report. And I said, well, what they look like? And then they described them. So we named them the people with long pubic hair. And so he says, they probably wouldn't want to be known by that. They'd rather be known by what they call themselves. And so these are some conversations that go on with us as well. And some of that work, like internally, like I some pretty hostile fights about whether it should be Tlingit or Klinkit spelled with a T. And so sometimes we're going to have to sort of facilitate some of these shifts for our own people. And some of that work is internal. And also, I think we've talked about this as well. Odds are pretty good that your language is going to have to update itself. What do you call, there's a whole bunch of different groups of people. What do you call them? What do you call people, because you could use some of this stuff. You could say, if someone's from Korea, you could say Korean Sati, and you could just use something from their language. But some of us have terms like Chanwan is in the Tlingit language. That's a term that should be retired. It comes from the English word Chinaman. And so it just refers to someone who's Chinese, I guess. And so and then Uchka is black person. And so like there's been some dialogues about that as well, which is sometimes the language needs to update itself. There used to be terms. Here's something that's kind of weird. So we had this term, what is it? They translate it as coward right now. Yisakuke, dasatati tichtatank.
Oh, I've heard it before. What is it? I can't think of it.
Qatran. So qatran is a word that I think long time ago used to be essentially two-spirited. I think it was specifically a male who takes on a female role. And then I think also there were probably other terms, but that has been translated recently as coward. And I don't think that that's the original word. And I'll show you, I'll share an example from Lakota, because I used to visit with lots of Lakota people when I was down in Minnesota. And this one elder there, he was telling me about this term, Winkte, that's in Lakota. And he said, long time ago, Winkte wasn't a bad term. It meant a male who assumes the role of a female. And that could be physically, that could be sexually, it could be socially. And so sometimes, and there was a gradient of this. Like, so maybe instead of going to fight, you stayed back and protected the village. Or maybe you went and you just held the horses. And he says it wasn't necessarily an insult, but now it's an insult when you call someone that, like they're going to fight you. And this was especially in the 90s when there was this really like pretty blatantly homophobic culture, just generally, especially among American men. And there still is today, but I think back then there were particular terms that people would use that would, you know, and so like the language itself is probably going to need to go through some conversations about what kinds of things need to be updated. And those are not going to be easy conversations, because sometimes you might say, okay, well, this more accurately reflects what's in the language, so that's how we're going to translate it now. And then some people are going to accuse you of changing the language, when really you're changing the way it's being interpreted into English, which is debatable. Anybody got any thoughts on any of that?
This kind of has something to do with it, but not really. My niece, because she had all uncles, so when she first started talking, she called me uncle, and she couldn't say Vic, so she called me Uncle Ick. And like 20 years later, that's what I'm known as, Uncle Ick, but it's a term of endearment.
That's awesome. So the other thing I was thinking about, a lot of times you're expected to be developing some materials or using materials that have been developed. So at the base level, I think there's usually a workbook, a dictionary, and a grammar. And then you sort of build activities off of these three primary documents. So a workbook is basically saying, you're getting started, here's where you start. Here's the first sounds we're going to teach you, here's the first words we're going to teach you, here's the first phrases we're going to teach you. Everything builds upon itself. And the advantage of having a workbook is sort of like, no matter where someone studies, they could jump into another program. And everybody's more or less building along the same path. And it's not like you always have to do these things the exact same way, but it could be sort of like, we'll do this thing, then this thing. At the base level, we'll do this stuff. And then your teacher can choose to teach you a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Then a dictionary is sort of saying, we want to document every part of the language. And so it's going to be up to you how to structure those things. Right now in Tlingit, I'm doing everything that's not a verb, then all the verbs, all in one dictionary altogether. I've been told plenty of times that I'm not qualified to do this, but I'm doing it. Then there's a grammar, and a grammar basically says, here's the structure of the language. And so trying to sort of develop that structure, every language is going to function a little bit differently. At some level, you're going to have to take people beyond memorizing stuff and reciting it into like internalizing an entire grammar into their own consciousness, so that human beings can have multiple grammars, at least most human beings. Like there are some people who don't have the same facilities as everybody else, but most human beings can have multiple grammars nested, which means they could think in multiple ways simultaneously, which is kind of cool. But then like the big question for me is, how are you going to help people build that within their own mind? So go ahead and tell me in this last minute.
I was just reflecting on memorization because it's been a big part of my beginning journey in Tlingit. And our cultures tell us how and what to say. And so, there were things like when I started learning Tlingit that I wanted to be able to say to Tlingit people and speakers and elders. And those were mostly, not just not just I'm Athabascan, but also why I wanted to learn Tlingit and what I like about it. So that I can like build a relationship and state my intentions with folks. So I came to your office with like my best attempt at, 6 sentences describing those things. And you helped me refine it. And I memorized those because they would be sitting for me like a comfortable room in Tlingit Tundetani that I could always go back to and feel comfortable and understood. Even today, if I'm speaking to people, those few sentences ground me as like a comfortable conversation space that I can go back to, and they continue to be sort of an anchor for me. And so memorization, and I just memorized those. I didn't understand the words or the grammar, but you explained to us that once you get into intermediate, you need to move beyond just memorizing. And so, whereas before, anytime you would talk about grammar, I would just be like, well, I'm not going to get that. I don't feel like it. Now I've started to challenge myself to like understand what is a classifier. But my main priority when I'm listening to you explain grammar is how do I use this? So how do I go from saying I ate to did you eat? And so those are the like key things I'm listening for when I'm learning about grammar.
Sheesh. We'll pick it up there. Go drink your talking juice, whatever's going to get you to talk a little bit more. And but it's all good. And think about this, and you'll have it. I'll ask you the same question on Wednesday: is how do you nest an entire grammar into folks? And I just want you to know, like, however you're teaching language right now, it's probably gonna be radically different 5 years from now, and 5 years from then, 5 years from then, 5 years from then. So it's on this path of continuous change and sometimes development, not on some course of modernity and progress, but just in terms of like the more you do a thing, the more you sort of realize there's different ways to do that thing. And then everybody's going to learn different, and some things are going to hit more than others with different folks. But same with this class, like as we're developing, these are brand new classes. Like it's really fun to be able to have these courses with you folks. But also, like, if you think of different ways that we could be doing this stuff, and especially in whether that's now or 10 years from now or whenever, feel free to let us know. And to also, like, maybe some of you will be teaching these classes and I'll be off writing Tlingit soap operas so I can do all these good breakup phrases and all kinds of fun stuff. Okay, thanks a lot, folks. We'll see you on Wednesday.
Emanates.
Namasi.
Nabasi. Oh, sheesh.